The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across the rows of neatly trimmed lawns and picket fences. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to go wrong, until it did. Deborah Williams stood on the sidewalk, clutching a stack of papers in her trembling hands. Her heart raced as she stared at the house in front of her. It was perfect. 4 bedrooms, a backyard big enough for the kids to play in, and a school district that promised a brighter future. But as she walked up the driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The landlord, Richard Grayson, stood in the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. She forced a smile and extended her hand. "Hi, I'm Deborah Williams. We spoke on the phone about the rental." His eyes flicked to her hand, but he didn't take it. Instead, he glanced over her shoulder, his gaze lingering on her family waiting in the car. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "The property's no longer available." Deborah's smile faltered. "But we just spoke this morning. You said—" He cut her off. "I said it's no longer available." And with that, he turned and closed the door in her face. Deborah stood there frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't the first time she'd been turned away because of the color of her skin. But this time, something inside her snapped. This time, she wasn't going to let it go. Little did she know, this moment would set off a chain of events that would change everything. Not just for her, but for Grayson too. Because fate has a way of striking back when you least expect it. Deborah didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a story about a house. It was a story about power, prejudice, and the lengths one woman would go to protect her family. It was a story about a man who thought he was untouchable, until he wasn't. And it was a story about how sometimes the universe has a way of balancing the scales. But first, Deborah had to make a choice. Would she walk away, like so many others had before her? Or would she stand her ground and fight? The answer would come sooner than she thought, because as she turned to walk back to the car, her phone buzzed with a notification. A local news outlet had picked up her story. And just like that, the fight was no longer hers alone. Deborah Williams wasn't just a woman fighting for a house. She was a mother, a wife, and a dreamer. Her life, like so many others, was a delicate balancing act, juggling work, family, and the relentless pursuit of a better future. Her days began before the sun rose, with the soft hum of the coffee machine and the quiet creak of the floorboards as she tiptoed past her children's rooms. Jalen, her 8-year-old son, was a ball of energy, always asking questions and dreaming of becoming a scientist. Maya, her 5-year-old daughter, was quieter, her wide eyes always observing the world with a curiosity that made Deborah's heart swell. Together, they were her reason for everything. But life wasn't easy. Marcus, her husband, worked long hours at the warehouse, his hands calloused and his shoulders heavy with the weight of providing for their family. Deborah herself worked 2 part-time jobs, one at a diner and another as a freelance writer, but it never felt like enough. They were stuck in a cramped apartment, the walls closing in on them with each passing day. The search for a new home wasn't just about space, it was about hope. A hope that somewhere out there, a better life was waiting for them. Their current neighborhood was a patchwork of fading buildings and cracked sidewalks, where the sound of sirens was as common as the chirping of birds. But it was home, at least for now. The local park was Jalen's favorite place, where he could run free and imagine a world where anything was possible. Maya preferred the library, her small hands clutching picture books as she whispered the words to herself. Deborah often found herself watching them, her heart aching with a mix of pride and fear. Pride in the people they were becoming, and fear that the world wouldn't give them the chances they deserved. It was this fear that drove her to keep searching, keep fighting, even when it felt like the odds were stacked against her. Richard Grayson, on the other hand, lived in a world of polished surfaces and calculated moves. His real estate empire was built on a foundation of privilege and power, his name synonymous with success in the city. He lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town, far removed from the struggles of people like Deborah. To him, the Williams family was just another name on a list, another problem to be dealt with. He didn't see their dreams, their struggles, or their humanity. All he saw was a risk, one he wasn't willing to take. But Grayson's world wasn't as untouchable as he believed. Beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that Deborah would soon expose. The day Deborah first saw the house on Maple Street, it felt like a sign. It was everything they'd been looking for: a safe neighborhood, good schools, and a backyard where Jalen and Maya could play. She'd filled out the application with trembling hands, her heart racing with hope. But that hope was shattered the moment Grayson closed the door in her face. The drive home was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Marcus reached for her hand, his touch a silent promise that they'd get through this together. But Deborah couldn't shake the feeling of defeat. It wasn't just about the house. It was about the message Grayson had sent, that people like her didn't belong in places like that. And that message cut deeper than she cared to admit. Later that night, as Deborah scrolled through her phone, she came across a post in a local community group. It was a story about another family who'd been turned away by Grayson under similar circumstances. The comments were filled with anger and frustration, but also with a sense of helplessness. That's when an idea began to form. What if she wasn't the only one? What if there were others who'd been silenced, their stories buried beneath Grayson's polished facade? Deborah hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. Sharing her story would mean stepping into the spotlight, exposing herself and her family to scrutiny. But it would also mean taking a stand. And sometimes, standing up was the only way to move forward. The morning after Deborah decided to share her story, the world felt different. The air was charged with a quiet tension, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. She'd posted her experience online, detailing the encounter with Grayson and the sting of his words. By the time she woke up, the post had already been shared hundreds of times. Comments poured in, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of discrimination. But amidst the solidarity, there was also backlash. Strangers questioned her motives, accused her of lying, and even threatened her family. Deborah's hands shook as she read the messages, her heart torn between hope and fear. She'd wanted to make a difference, but she hadn't anticipated the cost. And then the call came. It was a local journalist, Sarah Mitchell, who reached out first. Her voice was calm but urgent, asking Deborah if she'd be willing to share her story on a larger platform. Deborah hesitated. Going public would mean exposing her family to even more scrutiny, but it would also mean holding Grayson accountable. After a long conversation with Marcus, she agreed. The interview was set for the next day. As she hung up the phone, Deborah felt a mix of emotions: relief, fear, and a flicker of hope. But Grayson wasn't the type to sit back and let his reputation be tarnished. He'd built his empire on control, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Grayson watched the news unfold from the comfort of his office, his jaw tightening with each new headline. He'd spent years cultivating an image of success and respectability, and now this woman, this nobody, was threatening to tear it all down. He picked up the phone and dialed his lawyer. "We need to shut this down," he said, his voice low and steady, "before it gets out of hand." Within hours, a statement was released to the press. It was carefully worded, denying any wrongdoing and painting Deborah as a disgruntled applicant trying to exploit the system for her own gain. The narrative began to shift, and Grayson's supporters rallied behind him. But Deborah wasn't the only one watching. Others who'd been silenced by Grayson's actions began to come forward, their stories adding fuel to the fire. Deborah sat in front of the camera, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The studio lights were blinding, and the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest. Sarah Mitchell leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. "Deborah, can you tell us what happened when you met Richard Grayson?" Deborah took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but as she recounted the encounter, it grew stronger. She talked about the look in Grayson's eyes, the way his words had cut through her like a knife. She talked about her children and the future she wanted for them. And she talked about the countless others who'd been turned away simply because of who they were. By the time she finished, there was silence in the room. Even Sarah seemed momentarily speechless. The interview aired that evening, and the response was immediate. Grayson's phone began to ring nonstop, reporters, business partners, even city officials demanding answers. His carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. and he could feel the walls closing in. But Grayson wasn't the type to go down without a fight. He called a press conference, his demeanor calm and collected as he addressed the cameras. "These allegations are baseless," he said, his voice steady. "I have always conducted my business with integrity and fairness. This is nothing more than a smear campaign by individuals who seek to profit from my success." His words were convincing, but the cracks in his facade were starting to show. Behind the scenes, his legal team scrambled to contain the fallout, while his business partners began to distance themselves. The battle lines had been drawn, and Deborah found herself at the center of a storm she never could have imagined. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and tension. Deborah's story had ignited a firestorm, and the flames were spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. Grayson's empire, once untouchable, was now under siege. Protesters gathered outside his office, their chants echoing through the streets. "No justice, no peace," they shouted, their voices a unified roar against decades of systemic discrimination. Grayson watched from his window, his jaw clenched and his fists tight. He wasn't used to feeling powerless, and it infuriated him. But he wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. Deborah, too, was struggling under the weight of the spotlight. Every interview, every rally, every hateful comment chipped away at her resolve. She'd started this fight for her family, but now it felt like the whole world was watching and judging. At home, the strain was beginning to show. Marcus tried to stay strong for Deborah, but the constant threats and harassment were taking their toll. Jalen and Maya, too young to fully understand what was happening, could sense the tension. They clung to Deborah, their small hands gripping hers as if they could anchor her to the present. "Mommy, why are people so mad at us?" Jalen asked one night, his wide eyes filled with confusion. Deborah's heart broke as she struggled to find the words. How do you explain hatred to a child? How do you tell them that the world isn't always fair? She pulled him close, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "We're going to be okay," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm going to make sure of it." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, Grayson was fighting back with everything he had. His legal team filed a defamation lawsuit against Deborah, claiming her accusations were false and damaging to his reputation. The lawsuit was a calculated move, designed to intimidate and silence her. Deborah felt the weight of it like a physical blow. She didn't have the resources to fight a legal battle, and the thought of losing everything terrified her. But she wasn't alone. The community rallied around her, organizing fundraisers and offering support. Even strangers reached out, sharing their own stories and thanking her for her courage. It was a reminder that this fight wasn't just about her. It was about all of them. As the lawsuit loomed, Deborah found herself facing another challenge. A local news outlet uncovered a piece of her past, a mistake she'd made years ago, one she'd worked hard to put behind her. The story was twisted and sensationalized, painting her as unreliable and dishonest. Grayson's team seized on it, using it to further discredit her. Deborah felt the ground crumbling beneath her feet. She'd fought so hard to build a better life for her family, and now it felt like it was all slipping away. "Maybe we should just walk away," Marcus said one night, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We can't keep doing this." Deborah looked at him, tears in her eyes. "If we walk away now, he wins," she said. "And I can't let that happen." Just when it seemed like the odds were insurmountable, a breakthrough came. A former employee of Grayson's came forward, offering to testify about the discriminatory practices he'd witnessed. His testimony was damning, detailing how Grayson had systematically denied housing to black families and other marginalized groups. The media frenzy reached a fever pitch, and the pressure on Grayson intensified. But he wasn't the type to back down. In a desperate move, he called Deborah directly. His voice was cold and measured, but there was an edge of desperation beneath the surface. "You think you're winning," he said. "You have no idea what you're up against." Deborah's heart raced, but she refused to let him intimidate her. "This isn't about winning," she said. "It's about doing what's right." The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. Deborah sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the room, Grayson sat with his legal team, his expression unreadable. The lawsuit had dragged on for months, each day a new battle in a war that felt endless. But today was different. Today, the final arguments would be made, and the judge would deliver his verdict. Deborah's heart pounded as she glanced at Marcus, who sat in the front row with Jalen and Maya. Their faces were a mix of hope and fear, a reflection of her own emotions. She'd come so far, fought so hard, but the outcome was still uncertain. And then, the judge entered the room. The judge's voice was calm but firm as he summarized the case. He spoke of the evidence, the testimonies, and the legal arguments made by both sides. Deborah's mind raced as she listened, her stomach twisting into knots. The moment of truth was here, and there was no turning back. But just as the judge was about to deliver his verdict, Grayson's lawyer stood. "Your Honor," he said, "we'd like to request a recess. New evidence has come to light that could significantly impact this case." The room erupted into murmurs, and Deborah's heart sank. What new evidence? What was Grayson trying to pull now? The judge granted the request, and the courtroom emptied, leaving Deborah alone with her thoughts. During the recess, Deborah received a message from Sarah Mitchell, the journalist who'd been covering her story. "Meet me outside," it read. Deborah's hands trembled as she stepped into the hallway, where Sarah was waiting with a folder in her hands. "I just got this," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "It's from an anonymous source inside Grayson's company. It's proof of everything you've been saying." Deborah's heart raced as she flipped through the documents. Emails, internal memos, even recorded conversations, all of it detailing Grayson's discriminatory practices. It was the smoking gun they'd been searching for. But there was a catch. "If we use this," Sarah said, "it could blow the case wide open, but it could also put you in danger. Grayson's not going to take this lying down." Deborah stared at the folder, her mind racing. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment that could change everything. But it came with a price. Was she willing to pay it? Deborah returned to the courtroom, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. She glanced at Grayson, who was whispering furiously with his lawyer. He looked up, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, she saw something in his expression, fear. It was fleeting, but it was there. And in that moment, Deborah knew what she had to do. When the judge called the court back to order, she stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, "I'd like to submit new evidence." The room fell silent as she handed the folder to the bailiff. Grayson's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled him. As the evidence was presented, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The weight of Grayson's actions, once hidden behind a facade of respectability, was laid bare for all to see. The judge's verdict was swift and decisive. Grayson was found guilty of discriminatory practices, and the court ordered him to pay damages to Deborah and the other plaintiffs. The room erupted into cheers, but Deborah felt numb. She'd won, but it didn't feel like a victory. Grayson's empire was crumbling, but the cost had been high. As she left the courtroom, reporters swarmed around her, their questions a blur of noise. She pushed through the crowd, her eyes searching for Marcus and the kids. When she finally saw them, she broke down, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered, pulling them close. "It's finally over." The weeks that followed the verdict were a whirlwind of change. Grayson's empire, once a towering symbol of power and privilege, crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. His properties were seized, his reputation destroyed, and his name became synonymous with injustice. For Deborah, the victory was bittersweet. She'd won the battle, but the scars of the fight remained. The threats and harassment had taken their toll, and the constant scrutiny had left her exhausted. But as she stood in the doorway of their new home, a house they'd finally been able to rent without fear of discrimination, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible. Deborah's story had become more than just a personal victory. It had sparked a movement, one that resonated far beyond her community. People across the country began to share their own stories of discrimination, their voices amplified by the courage she'd shown. Legislation was introduced to address housing inequality, and organizations dedicated to fighting systemic racism saw a surge in support. Deborah found herself at the center of it all, not as a victim, but as a leader. She spoke at rallies, met with lawmakers, and continued to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. But amidst the chaos, she never lost sight of what mattered most: her family. Marcus stood by her side through it all, his quiet strength a constant source of support. Jalen and Maya, too young to fully understand the magnitude of what had happened, knew one thing for certain: their mom was a hero. "You're like a superhero, Mommy," Jalen said one night, his eyes wide with admiration. Deborah smiled, her heart swelling with love. "Not a superhero," she said, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Just someone who decided to stand up for what's right." Maya, ever the observer, reached for Deborah's hand. "I want to be like you when I grow up," she said softly. Deborah's eyes filled with tears. In that moment, she knew that every struggle, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt had been worth it, because her children would grow up in a world where they knew their voices mattered. As for Grayson, his fall from grace was swift and merciless. Stripped of his wealth and power, he became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one is above the consequences of their actions. Deborah never saw him again, but she often wondered if he'd learned anything from the ordeal. Did he feel remorse? Or was he still clinging to the belief that he'd been wronged? She didn't know, and in the end, it didn't matter. His story was no longer hers to carry. She'd let go of the anger and the pain, choosing instead to focus on the future. Deborah's journey wasn't just about one house or one landlord. It was about the power of a single voice to ignite change. It was about the strength of a community coming together to fight for what's right. And it was about the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to rise above even the darkest of circumstances. As she stood in her new backyard, watching Jalen and Maya play under the warm glow of the setting sun, Deborah felt a sense of gratitude she couldn't put into words. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still battles to fight, still injustices to confront. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to hope, to believe that the world could be better. And as the laughter of her children filled the air, she knew one thing for certain: no matter what came next, she'd face it with the same courage and determination that had brought her here. Because sometimes, the greatest victories aren't measured in courtrooms or headlines. They're measured in the quiet moments of joy, the knowledge that you've made a difference, and the hope that tomorrow will be better than today. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Deborah whispered a silent promise to herself, to her family, and to the world: "This is just the beginning."